Okay, let's begin again with a short prayer. Father, we pray your blessings and encouragement on those who are working on alleviating the pandemic, most particularly those working for a vaccine. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Amen. So, last week we were beginning to look at a large number of Lutheran or Protestant theologians, mainly Lutheran, who came on the scene at this time. And as I mentioned, the distribution of people, like Catholic areas were Catholic, Lutheran areas were Lutheran, and that had all kind of been settled. So the Lutherans were free, Protestants in general were free to begin to study their theology rather than just trying to defend themselves against the Catholics. So going on, there was another man by the name of Ulrich Ritchie, and he started a new interest in virtually every area of theology. He was a great preacher, as well as church history. And he stressed the great importance of the church, the Bible, and Luther. When we look at the Roman Catholic community, we have a great value for the Bible, and we have a great value for the church, which we call tradition. So we have the church and the Bible. There's no particular person like Luther. When you go through the study of theology, and we're going to see some more of that later, it's really interesting that, like when I was studying theology, beginning, we were still very much into Thomas Aquinas as being the greatest thing that had ever happened in theology. But by the time I was finishing theology, there were a dozen big names, huge names in theology. And when you study Catholic theology, the big names are usually contemporary now. They're very contemporary people. But the thing is that in the Roman Catholic Church, theology is the liaison between the Bible and the world. And because our world is changing rapidly, that our theology goes through these changes. And that it's very, I think, hard on people when you watch how long we went without really changing our theology, like Thomas Aquinas. But the world changed very slowly during that period. And so the Bible remains the same, and the church tradition remains the same. But theologians change and alter it. And it's very important in the Catholic Church that theology develops, not that it makes a radical change. And that, incidentally, is true to the Lutheran community, too. I'd also like to point out the importance of Luther as a theologian. The Protestant communities, now again, in the scheme of things, to be honest, in church history, the Protestant communities are relatively recent. Okay? So in the scheme of things, this doesn't surprise me, but most all of the Protestant theologians go back to their original guy. So like, for instance, Lutherans will tend to look at the Bible, but through Luther's commentaries. Calvinists will tend to look at the Bible, but through Calvin's view of the Bible. So their founders have become very, very important. And in the Catholic Church, that was true for the first almost 1,000 years. So I don't know how long it'll take with regards to the Protestants. There are two things about this man that were very, I would say, unusual. Number one, he denied original sin. And that's really interesting because in the theology of Luther, original sin's very, very important, because that's why you know that you're never going to cease to be a sinner and you're never going to cease sinning. But you turn to God for forgiveness and accept grace upon you. But it's because of a defect in us that we call original sin. Having denied original sin, he emphasized the great goodness of people and the ability of people to do good and this sort of thing. And I guess an example in the Roman Catholic Church in the past few years has been a man by the name of Matthew Fox, who writes about original goodness. He turns his back really on original sin. I don't know whether he ever actually denies it. But when you do that, you begin to develop more the goodness of people, that the people are essentially good and people can turn to God and all this sort of thing. And I think sometimes we're divided into people who teach original sin so strongly you don't think people can do any good, and others who teach people as doing so much good there obviously is no original sin. And we really need to be balanced. I think a good example of the balance is what we see in Paul, where the good I want, I find myself not doing. The evil I want to avoid, I find myself doing. He recognizes the essential defect that we carry with us, but somehow it doesn't prevent us from achieving great good over our lives. So anyway, the balance can be lost. Another theologian at this period was Adolf von Harnack, and he stressed that the teachings of Jesus were actually a very simple moral code. However, over a period of time, it had been distorted and buried under dogmas. So that, like in the Catholic Church, we have dogmas. And dogmas usually come about because of disputes in the church. But an example of a dogma is that Jesus is God, okay? Harnack would maintain that whether or not Jesus is God isn't important. It's the moral code that he presents, Is Mary a virgin? It doesn't matter. The moral code of Jesus is what matters. So he really tried to get away from dogmas. And that would be more understandable to me if the dogmas somehow distorted or changed the moral code. But they don't. We have the dogmas, we have the moral code. And he just seems to think the dogmas are unimportant and the moral code is. Example of the same thing, incidentally, is Thomas Jefferson, who saw Jesus as a moral code. Another one at this time is called Ernest Totlich, and he was fascinated by the way religion is influenced by surrounding society and culture in the same way religion influences society and culture. And I think it's an example would be you go into let's say the beginning of the church. When we began to gather as a community, we ended up with very long buildings when we were allowed to build buildings. And the buildings had a raised area with the altar on it, and this was all set up. And actually, we get that from the Roman throne room, and it's called a basilica. And it's a standard thing. Some of the very modern churches today, the highest point in the church is the last pew. And the pews go down like this to an area where the altar is in the center. And what we're seeing there is the influence of this idea of us being a community gathered around the altar rather than emphasizing that Jesus is king. He's king, and we're always a community. But the thing is, the influence of the community will alter that. At the same time, the teaching of religion very much alters society. An example would be every Christian country, for instance, or influenced by Christian, ends up with holidays. That wasn't a big thing in the past and hasn't been a big thing in, let's say if you take someplace like India, if you go to the history of India, you'll find out that there are 1,000 different sects in Hinduism. And each sect would celebrate what they wanted at one time or another, but you had no great holidays that somehow, but that's true of Christian countries, so that the religion influences society, and society does influence religion. It goes back and forth. While the industrial development was later in Germany, remember this industrial development seemed to begin in England, but it was later in Germany. The Catholic social movement began at the same time making efforts to protect workers from uncontrolled exploitation by the wealthy. If you remember, we were talking about this in England when the initial thing started and the industrial revolution began and workers were coming into the cities and everything, the church noticed that when they were coming into the cities, they were actually better off than they were out in the countryside. And it's because they had, they had access to medicine and stuff like that, and they slept, better in houses and stuff like that. But there were a huge amount of problems they encountered. But because their life was actually better than it had been as peasants, the church didn't see a real call to that initially. Then when that call began, the church became very much involved in social work in the cities. And because Germany began an industrial movement later, the church's interest in the social development was simultaneous in Germany. It wasn't a matter of one coming and then the other. And self-employed workers and peasants were the first to be protected. But slowly attention actually turned to factory workers. It was easier to deal with those who were self-employed. An example of a self-employed would be a jeweler. A jeweler would open a little shop and this sort of thing. But they were much easier to deal with that than to deal with these huge factories where you would have, the factory owner who was extremely wealthy, had all kinds of resources at his benefit to stop any kind of help for the people. But slowly the attention turned to factory workers. There was a bishop by the name of von Kelter of Mainz, and he had served originally as a parish priest in a poor parish in Hanover. And seeing the hard life of the peasants during a time of great famine and caring for them through a typhoid epidemic. And because he did that, he was very, very committed to what went on in the cities. He was been a poor parish. He'd also been there when the famine came. So he was very, very committed. In 1848, he preached a powerful series of sermons on the social problems of the poor as he had experienced them. So understand that before this time, a lot of the bishops came out of the royalty. And so while many of them great preachers and stuff like that, they really did not understand the problems of the poor. And this man really did. So later these sermons were collected and published in book form, and they provided German Catholics as a blueprint that they would use for helping workers and this sort of thing. One of the things that I find interesting in history is how often literature has a great effect on society. In the United States, you'd look at something like Uncle Tom's Cabin that greatly influenced the fact of the Civil War and things like that. But anyway, this work brought Catholics not only into the concern for the problems of the people, but a plan about what they could do to help it. In 1850, Spain faced many problems. Some of the regions that had benefited from trade with the colonies and other areas had become very poor. Remember, Spain was cut off from their colonies at this point, and they seemed no hope of finding better ways in their lives. Almost all the colonies of Spain had been lost. If you remember that the Spanish colonies were shipping stuff to Spain, but the English fleet greatly influenced that so that very little of it was getting through to Spain. And if what you're doing is dealing with stuff like that, if you lose it, you don't know how to function, because that's the base. I guess an example would be in the United States, in the areas where tobacco has been raised. They're very much at odds as to how to function now that tobacco production is not a way to make a lot of money. An example of that too is the idea is we're beginning to rely less and less on fossil fuels. People who work in the coal industry and the oil industry are terrified because they can't foresee what they would do outside of that. The fact of the matter is, in history, we always go through evolutions like that. And when we go through evolutions like that, as we move away from fossil fuels, for instance, there will be things created that we don't know anything about now that will require workers and development and that sort of thing. But it's a frightening thing to watch it coming. And so Spain was in a very great difficulty now. Liberals were calling for modernizing the country by dividing the huge land holdings of the wealthy and the church and giving them to small farmers. So the liberals were saying what we need to do now is to take these huge land holdings that the government has and the lands holdings that the church has and sort of divide this up and give it freely to farmers who will work it. The fact of the matter is the large land holdings, particularly of the church, the large land holdings of the church, were tax exempt, so the church could hold them, and people worked like serfs on them. The church benefited from the produce and everything that came off the land, but the people essentially were serfs. But they were the ones working the land and everything, and they could, divide it up and let it grow that way. And so this began to be one of the things that was going on. Because the church and the wealthy were really opposed to this, obviously, and it made the church appear very much on the side of the wealthy. And as a result of that, many of the liberals in Spain at this time were very, very anti-Catholic. And it's because the church was seen in opposition to this. Again, you take a huge monastery, has all kinds of lands, and the lands, originally they got the lands because the monks were farming them. Now there's too much land for the monks to farm, so they hire people out to farm it, and you basically these people ending up serfs. So at that point, the monastery doesn't know how it will survive without all these lands. But on the other hand, if they get most of the land away, the monks there can actually farm the land they have and support the monastery or open a school or anything. Again, this idea of adjusting our income to a world that's coming rather than trying to hold that world back because, certain things we are doing are working. Anyway, the liberals often were very anti-Catholic. In 1833, a long crisis began with the king, who was succeeded by a 3-year-old daughter. Okay, so the King of Spain's succeeded by a 3-year-old daughter. There was a revolution with the daughter fleeing the country, although ultimately her son returned as King Alfonso XII in 1875. Spain adopted a constitution following the British form of government. So they chased out the little girl who grew up, got married, and had a son. Her son came back as king, but when he came back, they ended up with a constitutional government. So we had a king as a figurehead, and we still have that in Spain. We have a king as a figurehead, and basically we have this parliament that really runs the country. The following years saw a great growth of trade unions, and at times the government was controlled by the liberals, sometimes by the conservatives. So there was a liberal branch, a conservative branch in Spain. Conflicts between the state and the church grew bitter, and Catholics in Spain were divided as well. See, the difficulty is if you're a Catholic and you see the church with too much land that should be distributed, to say that you appear to be anti-Catholic. And understand most of the Spanish were Catholics and loyal to the church. But as any parent knows, you can be very loyal to a child and demand certain things of a child. And that doesn't mean you don't like the child. I know my parents made me go to school, But it doesn't mean you don't like the child. It means you make the demands. And that's true with regards to the church. But oftentimes these people in the division were seen as Catholic and anti-Catholic, and that really wasn't the case very often. In 1898, Spain lost a war with the United States and saw the end of all its colonies in the New World. Okay, the Spanish-American War marked the end of Spain's thing. Younger Spaniards, especially writers and thinkers, were shocked as they found themselves in a small, weak nation, no longer with a mighty empire. Remember, at one time, Spain controlled Sweden. They controlled Netherlands. They controlled parts of Italy. Spain was massive. And at the time of the building of the colonies in the New World, Spain was the most important country in the entire world. And now, not too much longer later, maybe 150 years, 200 years, Spain is a very small country with no colonies and a poor country, okay? And so it was very, very hard on the people at the time. In 1850, the Catholic Church seemed to be gaining greater freedom in Protestant countries. In Great Britain, there was a Catholic Emancipation Act, removed all the laws against Catholics. There were terrible laws against Catholics that prevented them from participating in the government. And all of this comes basically from the fact of, after the death of Henry VIII, Queen Mary came in and persecuted the Protestants terribly, following by Queen Elizabeth, who persecuted the Catholics terribly. So the Protestants and Catholics in England were kind of divided. And when the Protestant government was fully established, they didn't allow bishops. They had all sorts of laws against the Catholics. And these were gradually being removed under the Catholic Emancipation Act. With the terrible famine in Ireland, many people left Ireland to settle in England. And at that point, remember, the Irish are Catholic. So as the Irish leave Ireland and began to settle in England, they of course bring their faith with them, which means that having given the freedom to the Catholic Church in England now, the number of Catholics is growing dramatically. A huge number of people came over from Ireland. Pope Pius IX, restored the Catholic hierarchy in England and in Wales. So they restored bishops, they named bishops. And so, like, for instance, like you have Canterbury, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is nominal head of the Church of England under the Queen. However, when the Catholic Church began to reestablish, we appointed a Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, they're not in competition at all. One's in charge of the Catholics, one's in charge of the Protestants, and things went on like that. But what we did was duplicate these titles in the Catholic Church because they had all been bishops at the time. 1 cardinal and 12 bishops were created, although there was strong Protestant opposition to allowing Roman Catholic bishops in England. There was still an opposition to the idea of the bishops coming in. I don't know why they saw the bishops as a threat. When you look at the Catholic Church, the real power with regards to the church actually is pastors. Pastors are the one teaching the people, taking care of the people, and this sort of thing. And so I don't see how they saw the bishops as a threat, but they did. And Cardinal Wiseman was the one appointed a cardinal, and he did an excellent job of reorganizing the church. And at the same time, he calmed the fears of Protestants, that our job was not to get a lot of Catholics, take over England, and make it a Catholic country. That isn't what we were about. And I don't think we could have done it if we wanted. But it certainly isn't what we were about. But allowing for the history of England, it would be very important for the English to realize that and know it. And they said it very clearly. Encouraged by the way that worked, Pius IX then restored the hierarchy in Calvinistic Holland. And the Catholic Church was soon making great progress there. And the thing that's interesting is that what we see modeled in the United States is going on now. When the Catholic Church is restored in England, we don't try and take over the government, so it's a Catholic country. We learn to function as a church in a country that isn't Catholic. We do that in Holland. It's so natural to us today to live in countries that are not Catholic and function as a Catholic church in the country in great freedom. It's so natural to us, we can't even imagine what it was for them. But if you're a national church and suddenly you're gone, you think, it's all over. As it wasn't true at all. This period, but to go on, in Ireland, the situation of the church was improving, but the problem of land ownership was becoming important. Catholics were not allowed to own land, and that was important because you couldn't vote if you didn't own land. Originally in the United States, you couldn't vote if you didn't own land either. But this was a common, they see the laws as governing the land, so if you don't own the land, you aren't invested in the laws, so why should you have a say in it? So anyway, this became important. Much of the land had been taken, as now was in the hands of English landowners, and the Catholics were becoming militant. Way more Catholics than Protestants were there, but the Protestants had the wealth. And you see exactly what was going on if you look in Northern Ireland today. Northern Ireland, that little piece, you find out that the really wealthy there are English who came over, were sent. The kings and queens of England just took land away from the big Catholic families and gave them. As if you watch on TV, watch Downton Abbey, it was an abbey at one time. And it was a Catholic abbey and all this, the monastery and everything there. But a huge amount of those big English homes were that at one time. And they were turned over by the king, gave them as gifts to his supporters. Catholics, however, now are becoming militant. This became known as the Fenian movement, after a legendary band of Irish warriors. In their history, they carry this knowledge of the Fenian warriors, much like the Robin Hood story or something like that. In 1879, Charles Stewart Parnell, an Anglo-Irish Protestant, began attracting Irish Catholics to his nationalist party. Okay, so he is Anglo, he came from England, he's in Ireland, and he's Protestant. But he formed a nationalist party and began attracting Catholics to this party. Soon, 4/5 of the Irish members of the British Parliament were members of that party. Now remember, they're Anglo and they're Protestant, so they could be elected to the English Parliament, something you couldn't do with a Catholic. A Catholic could not be elected to the English Parliament. But now there are these people, and this nationalist party was advocating for Catholics and their freedom and everything. But remember, it's Protestants doing it now. They're Anglicans who are doing this. They demanded an Irish Parliament and home rule, but they failed to gain British support. They obviously didn't dominate in the Parliament, but this was the first time it was presented. It was presented by Anglicans, that Ireland should be independent, have their own parliament, and in fact have home rule. The 1800s saw many people of many different religious backgrounds, and even no religious backgrounds as well, began to work to help the victims of poverty, mistreatment, and neglect. These people are going to rise, and this is not let's say, I wouldn't say this is a work of the Catholic Church. It isn't a work of any particular religion. It's just that people rise and see this. An example today was if you were to go on the TV and see an advertisement for St. Jude's Hospital, for instance. They have lots of advertisements on. St. Jude's Hospital is not necessarily supported by Catholics. St. Jude's Hospital is supported by all kinds of people who are interested in the work they're doing. If you go to the Shriners Hospital, same thing. They're Catholics who support the Shriners Hospital. Why? Because of what they're doing. And you can find all kinds of organizations like this. And this began at this time. Normally, if you were Catholic, you supported Catholic charities. You supported but now these different things began to develop from a lot of different people. We're going to look at several of them. In England, there was a Quaker. Her name was Elizabeth Fry. She was deeply religious, even held religious services in her home. I think you know in the Quakers there is no clergy. So if you wanted to get organized, you could hold services in your own home, and she used to. However, her great work was in prison reform in Newgate Prison. So having held these religious services, what she did was begin going into prisons to visit. This is particularly a women's prison now. She would go in and visit the women and see their conditions. And she began to work for reform in the prison system itself. And she conducted services for these women. She advocated for the separation of men and women. Interesting. It's unimaginable to us that you would have a prison with men and women together, but they did. Now, the men and women weren't in the same cell or anything, but men and women were housed in the same prison. She advocated for worthwhile employment, and that's worthwhile employment while you're in prison. The idea was you shouldn't just sit in a prison cell. You should have the opportunity to do things. And in many of these reforms, what they did was operate things in the prison, like, for instance, almost all the furnishings in all the prisons in California were made in one prison, and that prison had a woodworking shop. Well, the prisoners could work in there. If you work in there, I think you would get the equivalent of 50 cents a day or something. It's very minimal, but you actually learn a trade. The same thing, there are electrical shops in prisons. There are all kinds of things in prisons that they do work, but the key to the work is you learn something for when you get out. The thing you discover is a huge amount of people are in prison because of poverty. And the ability to get them out of poverty is to keep them out of prison. So you want to try this. And we have laws in the United States now that oftentimes prevent people who come out of prison from getting jobs, meaningful jobs. It's a hard system even today. Another thing she wanted them to have was religious instruction and education. Prisons are usually in favor of religious instruction because it makes the prison calmer. There's more calmness. And they're in favor of education. A lot of prisoners end up lawyers, that they study law basically with regards to their own case, and they are able by correspondence courses and stuff like that actually to get degrees. Her methods were tried in other prisons, and she even traveled throughout Europe. So she traveled throughout Europe showing how these reforms actually benefit the prisons. You see that when if I were to go into a prison today and I would have some idea of reform, I would need to argue how that reform would benefit the people running the prison. Not how it benefits the prisoners. It doesn't work to approach it that way. You have to show how it will benefit the people running the prison. So, how much money will you save on furniture if you can build it yourself? Okay. Now, my reason for having it was so prisoners could be trained in carpentry when they left. Your reason for having it was you have free labor in order to get the furniture. It doesn't matter how that works out. But the key thing to do is to do that. I think that's something that's very neglected, and I may have mentioned this before. For instance, in the movement about abortion, so much of the teachings are how an abortion harms a fetus, kills a fetus. And the whole idea is that people who have abortions don't believe the fetus is a human being. What you need to do is really analyze the whole thing of an abortion to find out how an abortion harms the person who has the abortion. And then you can begin to work on the whole abortion issue. Same thing happened with smoking. With smoking, originally they talked about how you had fires and stuff like this, and so people didn't care about that sort of thing. What you had to know was, how did smoking really harm people who were smoking? And when they began to get into that, smoking lessened, this sort of thing. That's the key to that sort of thing. You have to be able to show how your change will benefit the person who can make the change. To the degree you do that, you can bring change. Okay? In the United States, before the Civil War, work for prison reform was carried on by Reverend Lewis Dwight. Okay, so he's a Protestant minister. And he was looking at the same type of prison reform that Elizabeth Fry was. Now, Elizabeth Fry's prison reform was aimed primarily at women initially. But the same principles she brought for women, they wanted for men as well. Dwight was dealing specifically with men. He advocated the use of cell blocks and group labor over solitary confinement. A lot of prisons dealt primarily with solitary confinement, and you would be locked in a prison cell and never get out. And what happened is your body would be seriously damaged. You didn't have exercise. It affects you not to have sunlight on your skin and vitamin D. And there's a whole bunch of things that would be affected by the idea that you're enclosed alone in a thing. Needless to say, it didn't help your mental state either. And so the first thing he wanted was the prisoner should have some interaction with other people. Okay? I think if you remember way back when we were starting this study, do you remember the Catholic Church stopped people who were living as hermits? So if you're living as a hermit, you lead a community of hermits. So you meet occasionally and stuff like that, like Camaldoli. It is a community of hermits. You don't go off and live alone. Why? It makes people crazy. And so the same thing in a prison. If the people are alone in the prison, you may end up with crazy people. So he wanted cell blocks and group labor. This was first tried in the prison of Auburn, New York, and came to be known as the Auburn system. Okay, they first tried it there. And what they did was make cell blocks in which there were several prisoners in each cell, and the cells were in a set area, interrelated kind of with one another. And they went out to work in teams. Now, if you were disobedient or something, you could be put in solitary confinement. But solitary confinement was not the way prisoners were actually treated. Another one is Dorothy Dix. Dorothy Dix set out to improve the situation of the mentally ill. At first, these people were simply placed in prisons. We have a similar thing going on now. One of the things that really struck Ronald Reagan was the Russian way of dealing with dissidents. The Russians would take a dissident and simply declare them crazy and put them into a mental institution. And that way they could hold them as prisoners. And what Ronald Reagan advocated is that you cannot hold a person against their will unless they've actually committed a crime. Well, the end result of it is that we have people who are mentally defective on the streets who do commit the crimes, and then they go in the jail for a while. And what we need, is to somehow be able to distinguish who actually is mentally ill and get them into sort of a hospital-type situation where they can be taken care of. But at this time, they were all mentally ill people. Like if you walked along the street talking to yourself, you understand people at this time didn't have cell phones. Today we're used to everyone talking to themselves. But in this day, they didn't have cell phones. If you're walking along the street talking to yourself or something, they could put you in prison. She wrote a memorandum to the state legislature in Massachusetts, and the care of the mentally ill began to improve, with hospitals being established in many states. So then they began to establish hospitals for the mentally ill in many states and cull the mentally ill out of the hospitals, out of the prisons into the hospitals. She went to work in Canada and Europe as well. Dorothy Dix basically established this whole system of mental institutions in the whole world. She was the source of that. William Booth now was a Methodist minister. His wife's name was Catherine, and she worked very, very closely with him. He went to London and began a religious revival. He preached this revival, and people who made their decision for Christ or whatever he did in his revival began to form a group. So it was a revival group. And it took the name the Salvation Army. And they were organized very much like an army. As you know, they wear uniforms, very much like military uniforms. And so they were organized along this way. 2 years after they started, they opened a branch in the United States. They were to live lives of purity and pious seriousness, so that people were to live lives of purity. And this life of purity is as you and I would understand it in the Catholic Church. It wasn't celibacy. It was purity. If you were married, you were faithful to your marriage vows. If you were not married, you were not involved in a sexual relationship. You know, that's the purity they talked about. And they wanted religious seriousness. Now, what's religious seriousness? Religious seriousness is when you take your religion seriously. I remember last Sunday I was at church in San Luis Obispo on the other side of town called Nativity. And at the end of the liturgy, the pastor was making some announcements, and he told a story. He told the story that some people who were very involved in the church and everything, their family came to Mass on Christmas, and the mother wasn't with them. And then a couple days later, the mother was back at church. And so the priest said something to her about the fact that he was sorry she'd been sick at Christmas. She said, "I wasn't sick at Christmas at all." He says, "Oh, well, I saw you weren't at church, so that And her response was, "Well, I had to wrap Christmas presents, so I wasn't able to go to church." Now, that's someone who doesn't take their religion seriously, okay? So taking religion seriously is to meet the obligations of the religion and actually allow religion to affect your life. A lot of times, particularly Catholics, can separate their religion from their social awareness, so that they can be against immigrants, they can be against the poor, they can be against all these things, and yet they go to Mass on Sunday and listen to this sort of thing. That's not to take religion seriously. Religion seriously is that religion is a major force in my life. It affects the way I deal with you, the way I speak, the way I act, this sort of thing. And that's very much to the Salvation Army. They wanted this purity of life, and then they wanted religious seriousness. Their concern for every aspect of human life led them to an astonishing range of activities. And so as they started, their concern was that people should live these good lives. As they got going, they began to understand there are certain things that cause people not to live good lives. Maybe they don't get enough to eat. Well, so they started feeding people. Maybe they don't have jobs. They started giving jobs to people. They started doing all kinds of things that oftentimes we see. An example is prostitution. You know, very few people, I think, go into prostitution because it's a career choice. People go into prostitution because of desperation. So do you need laws against prostitution? Not really. What you need to do is reduce or eliminate the desperation. what drives a person to that. Eliminate that, okay? Now that's what the Salvation Army was about. And they really, I think we all know them as a powerful institution in the United States. In 1845, John Henry Newman, whom we saw earlier as leader of the Oxford movement in England, he moved to Rome after his conversion. So when he was an Anglican minister, and in studying the origins of church history and everything, he turned and converted to Catholicism, as did many of the people involved in the Oxford movement. And when he turned to Catholicism, Newman moved to Rome. Now, I'm not sure the purpose or anything behind that, but Newman was a brilliant scholastic. And what they probably did was that when he made his conversion at Oxford, and the Anglican institutions in England probably did not want him teaching there. So he probably went to Rome and was involved in teaching there. I don't really know, but that would seem sane to me. He had a great devotion to Philip Neri and decided to introduce the oratory in England. If you remember, Philip Neri used to organize diocesan priests. So he would come into an area like San Luis Obispo, where we have actually 3 Catholic churches, a Byzantine Catholic and 2 Roman Catholic churches. And what he would do is encourage the priests all to live together in a single house, and from that house to administer these churches so that they had a community. One of the really rough things today, when I was ordained a priest, like in the parish I was raised, there were never less than 3 priests in the parish. They would have dinner together and that sort of thing, and they had kind of a community in the parish. By the time I was ordained, there were 2 priests in most parishes. But within 5 years of my ordination, priests were largely alone in parishes. Now, I have only once been alone in a parish, and one of the reasons is that the bishops have always wanted me in a parish where I could go out and do teachings and do retreats like I've been doing, and so they had to have many priests there. The time I was put in a parish where I was alone was in Spreckles, but the reason they did that there is because there are so many retired priests. You know, if you want a lot of retired priests in your area, build golf courses. And of course, they're all over Monterey Peninsula and Carmel and stuff. So a lot of retired priests in the area. So it was easy to cover. So I went there. And so there was a shortage of priests at this time, remember, because of the Protestant thing now. So what he wanted to do was to get Catholic priests into these oratories. He founded them in Birmingham and in London. And he lived in Birmingham. With the Oratorians, he founded a school for boys and staffed a parish. So they began to staff a parish, but they also started a school for boys. He continued to write books and deliver sermons and lectures, gaining a reputation throughout the English-speaking world. I would say that Cardinal Newman and his writings are some of the very best examples of English literature of that day, and will probably stand his account of his conversion, Apologia Pro Vita Sua. His account of his conversion, it will be a classic forever, just like St. Augustine's, his Confessions. Okay, why don't we stop it here, and we're going to talk a little more about Cardinal Newman and the development of this sort of thing throughout the world next week. Thank you again for your attention.